What happens when a house remembers more than its people? High on Blackwood Ridge, a silhouette of jagged spires tears at the sky. This is Marlowe Mansion. For a century, it has stood not as a home, but as a monument to silence. Its Gothic bones, draped in ivy, are a focal point for the town's darkest stories. The structure seems to breathe, exhaling a cold mist of forgotten sorrows. It is a place where architecture and myth have become one, a stone heart that stopped beating long ago. Even during the Great Depression, children told the story. A young boy reached through rusted iron, his hand brushing the cold stone of the gatepost. He swore he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The legends began with its architect and sole resident, Elias Marlowe. After his sudden death near the turn of the 20th century, whispers started. Tales of a profound melancholy that had seeped into the very foundation of his lonely creation. The stories are not of violent specters. They speak of something more insidious, a pervasive sadness. Locals report a weight in the air, a feeling of being watched by unseen, grieving eyes. They describe the faint sound of a music box playing a tune no one can recall, carried on the wind from shattered windows. But can a building truly hold emotion, trapping despair within its walls like a fly in amber? This question has fueled the legend for generations, echoes of the forgotten. Local historian Eleanor Vance has spent decades sifting through these tales, separating folklore from fact. She believes the mansion serves a vital purpose. In an age of constant noise and fleeting digital memories, places like Marlowe Mansion force us to confront the permanence of the past and stories that refuse to be erased. Its legend is a testament to our need for mysteries technology cannot solve, for echoes that resonate deeper than data. Marlowe Mansion is more than an abandoned relic. It is a living legend, a repository for the fears and sorrows of the community in its shadow. The townsfolk say the house has a memory and waits patiently for someone to listen. But the truth of what happened within those walls is far more complex and more human than any ghost story. The story begins not with a ghost, but with a promise made and a secret buried deep in the estate's cold, unforgiving soil. Before the whispers, there was the sound of construction. Marlowe Mansion was not born a ghost. It was built as a monument to one man's vast ambition. That man was Alistair Marlowe, an industrialist whose wealth was forged in steel and coal. He poured his fortune into the spires on Blackwood Ridge, a legacy of stone and glass to outlast his name. He envisioned a dynasty, a beacon of prosperity. The house was meant to be a beginning. It became an end. His wife, Ilara, possessed a quiet grace. She filled the cold halls with music from her piano. Their children, Thomas and Lily, were the heart of the home. On a crisp October evening, days before the end, their laughter echoed from the gardens as they chased fireflies, their small hands flickering brightly in the growing dark. It was a perfect, fragile moment, suspended before the silence fell. That silence arrived in autumn 1923. The official report was stark and swift, a murder-suicide. Alistair, driven by a hidden financial ruin, ended his family's lives before taking his own. The town was stunned. The Marlowe name, once a symbol of success, was now a stain of tragedy. But how could a man who built a fortress for his family become its destroyer overnight? The story felt incomplete, a puzzle with missing pieces. The mansion was sealed, its contents frozen in time. The tragedy became a local wound, a story told to frighten children from the ridge. A house remembers.
This history is not just a relic. It is the source code for the fear that permeates the property today. The sorrow of Alistair, Ilara, Thomas, and Lily is the foundation for every ghost story since. a persistent echo that refuses to fade. The official records closed the case. The newspapers moved on, but the people living in the mansion's shadow began to talk. They spoke of lights in empty windows and faint music on the night air. The official story was an ending, but for Marlowe Mansion, it was the beginning of a much darker tale. How does one dissect a ghost with the scalpel of history? Enter Dr. Evelyn Reed, not a ghost hunter, but a paranormal historian, a woman who wields academic rigor as a weapon against the shadows. For years, she has studied the Marlowe Mansion from afar, viewing it not as a haunted house, but as a historical crime scene frozen in time. Her work separates the verifiable tragedy of Alistair Marlowe's family from the century of folklore that has grown over it like ivy, choking the verifiable truth. She seeks the facts buried beneath the fear. The Blackwood Ridge Historical Society has granted her what no one else has received in 50 years: exclusive, uninterrupted access for 3 days. Her mission is to document, to analyze, to finally write the definitive account. She stood on the decaying porch, the cold, ornate iron key heavy in her palm. The massive oak door groaned open, releasing a breath of cold air thick with the scent of dust and forgotten memories. This wasn't a hunt. It was an archaeological dig into the very soul of the house. Her tools were not spirit boxes, but architectural blueprints and family correspondence. Echoes of the forgotten. Dr. Reed operates on a firm principle. A haunting is often just memory given a voice, grief given a shape. She believes the echoes in Marlowe Mansion are not supernatural entities, but the psychic residue of immense suffering, the final, desperate moments of the Marlowe family replaying themselves within the architecture of their sorrow. But how can a building of wood and stone hold on to sorrow with such tenacity? This investigation matters today because it forces us to confront how we mythologize tragedy, turning human pain into local legend, and how those legends can define a place for generations. She is here to restore the humanity to the ghost story. 72 hours, a finite window to decode a century of silence. Her goal is to give the Marlowes their real story back, to replace the chilling whispers with the quiet dignity of historical fact. But as the great oak door sealed her inside, the lock echoing through the cavernous foyer, Evelyn Reed was about to discover that some primary sources refuse to be read quietly. What sound does a 50-year silence make when it finally breaks? It is not a shout, but a groan. The sound of ancient oak complaining against rusted iron as the great doors to Marlowe Mansion were forced open for the first time in over 50 years. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood on the threshold, a lone figure, as the scent of entombed air rushed out to meet her. It was a smell of damp stone, desiccated paper, and something else, a faint, sweet rot like forgotten perfume. She stepped inside. The air was a physical weight, thick and cold and utterly still. A single shaft of light from the open door cut through the darkness, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes that had danced undisturbed for decades. This was not merely an abandoned space. It felt preserved, a pocket of time sealed from the world. Could a place, like a person, hold its breath for half a century, waiting for the first gasp of new air? The oppressive quiet was an answer in itself. It was a tangible presence, a blanket woven from stillness and Alistair's decaying ambition. The house remembers. Every unlit corridor and shrouded furniture seemed to pulse with a low, inaudible frequency. This is the allure of the forbidden room, the sealed archive. We are drawn to unearth these forgotten places, believing that in their dust we find a piece of our own lost history. For Dr. Reed, this was not a historical site. It was a conversation with the dead, and the house was the primary witness. Her footstep on the marble floor was a sacrilege, a sharp crack that the profound silence swallowed instantly. But the violation occurred, the seal was broken, and from the deep shadows of the grand foyer, she felt a distinct, unmistakable shift, as if something long dormant had just opened its eyes. Can a single room hold its breath for 50 years? After the groan of the great doors, an even greater silence descended. This was the grand foyer of Marlowe Mansion, a space not abandoned, but paused. Great shapes huddled under white dust cloths, their forms suggesting grand sofas and ornate tables, now sleeping giants in a forgotten kingdom. Sunlight, thick with a century of dust, cut through the gloom, illuminating a world sealed away from the flow of days and seasons. Dr. Evelyn Reed took a single, careful step onto the marble. The air was cold, still, and carried the scent of dry paper and faint, faded perfume. She could almost feel the final, frantic heartbeat of the house before it fell silent. Here, a massive tapestry clung to the wall, its threads depicting a hunt where both rider and beast had long since surrendered to the quiet siege of time. It was a tableau of arrested motion, a frozen moment. This was not the chaos of a home deserted in a hurry. It was something else, something more deliberate, as if a stage magician had failed to complete their final trick. But what time did the curtain fall? In the far corner, a sentinel of dark wood and brass offered the answer.
The grandfather clock, its pendulum meant to be marking the passage of Alistair Marlowe's legacy, was still. Its ornate hands were locked, pointing to a single immutable instant, 3:15. Was this the moment the tragedy struck? The second the heart of the house stopped beating? Or is time merely a suggestion here, a rule that the mansion's profound grief chose to ignore? This impulse to capture a moment is a deeply human one. We do it with photographs and saved letters, creating our own small pockets of preserved time against the inevitable tide of forgetting. But the Marlowe Mansion did not preserve a memory of joy. It enshrined an ending. The question for Evelyn, and for us, was no longer if the house was haunted, but what terrible event at 3:15 was so powerful it could shatter the very clockwork of reality. The answer, she suspected, was not in this room, but lay deeper within the mansion's silent, waiting heart. How can a perfect silence suddenly contain a voice? The grand foyer of Marlowe Mansion was a tomb of sound, its air thick and motionless for 50 years. Dr. Evelyn Reed, methodical as ever, worked within this profound stillness. She placed a high-sensitivity digital audio recorder on the third marble step of the main staircase, its tiny red light a lone, defiant spark in the gathering gloom. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the foyer cloaked in deep shadow. The only sound her own quiet breathing and the distant whisper of wind against ancient glass. Satisfied with the placement, she left it to listen to the void for 3 hours. When she returned and played the recording back through headphones, she expected to hear nothing but the machine's faint electronic hum. Instead, something impossible had been captured, a ghost literally woven from pure sound. It was the sound of a child's brief, airy laugh, a note of pure, unburdened joy that had no business existing in this mausoleum of frozen time, followed by the soft, definite creak of a single floorboard directly overhead. An echo remains. Dr. Reed knew this was no auditory illusion, no trick of the mind prompted by the oppressive atmosphere. It was data. What is a sound if not a vibration moving through the air from a physical source? Here was an effect without an apparent cause, a disembodied remnant that defied the simple laws of physics.
This is why modern paranormal research relies on sensitive recording equipment. It captures the subtle acoustic artifacts our own senses are designed to filter out. This one recording transformed Marlowe Mansion from a place of sad history into a place of active, unsettling mystery. But laughter, however faint, implies a presence. Was this a random echo trapped in the architecture, or was it a greeting from the other side of silence? Can a painting hold a gaze for a century? The disembodied whisper from the foyer had dissipated, yet its chilling resonance guided Dr. Reed forward. It drew her into the oppressive stillness of the main drawing room. There, commanding the space above a cavernous, cold marble hearth, hung the life-sized portrait of Elara Marlowe. Her face was a study in tragic beauty, but it was her eyes that seized the air. Through a masterful trick of shadow and light, they possessed an unnerving agency. Their painted irises seemed to track Reed's every cautious step across the dust-laden floorboards. It was an illusion that felt disturbingly alive. History remembers Elara as a celebrated socialite. She was a radiant figure in the early 20th century. She was meant to be the crowning jewel of Alastair Marlowe's vast fortune. Yet the artist who painted this testament saw beyond the public performance. He captured a profound, inescapable melancholy in her gaze, a loneliness that spoke volumes of a gilded cage and a spirit slowly suffocating beneath her husband's grand ambitions. How much of a person's true self can be trapped in layers of oil and varnish, held captive for decades within an ornate frame? An echo remains. The portrait was no longer just an artifact. It was a focal point, a silent, eternal witness to the mansion's long, slow decay. That single disembodied word from the foyer now felt less like a random ripple and more like a deliberate summons to this very spot. These preserved faces from the past are a powerful reminder. They show that history is not merely a record of grand events, but a tapestry woven from individual, often hidden sorrows. As Dr. Reed leaned closer, her breath misting in the frigid air, she saw it. The artist had hidden something. Tucked into the intricate brushwork of the lace on Elara's cuff was a symbol, almost invisible, yet now glaringly apparent. It was not a flaw, but a message waiting to be read. Sometimes the smallest objects cast the longest shadows. Leaving the gaze of Elara Marlowe's portrait behind, Dr. Reed ascended the grand staircase. One door on the second floor stood ajar, leaking a coldness born of pure loss, not malice. She pushed it open and entered the nursery. The room was stark, stripped bare, save for a single artifact sitting in the precise center of the floorboards. A porcelain doll. Its painted cheeks were unchipped, its lace dress impossibly clean after 50 years of neglect. It sat with perfect posture, its glass eyes fixed on the doorway in a perpetual, silent wait. This was a vigil. Records spoke of Alastair Marlowe's daughter, Lily, who succumbed to illness within these walls. But records are only ink on paper. This was a tangible piece of a shattered childhood. How can something so perfectly preserved radiate such profound desolation? This was the source, a silent echo. The doll was a vessel, a focal point for a grief so powerful it outlived the people who felt it. It was the emotional anchor for the disembodied whispers and the oppressive weight of the foyer. Even today, we see this impulse to preserve a lost loved one's treasured object, attempting to give a memory physical form. The Marlowe family, in their grief, had unknowingly created something far more potent. Dr. Reed knelt, her professional detachment fraying. The historian saw a priceless artifact. The human saw a monument to a life cut short. The silence in the room thickened, becoming expectant. The doll's unblinking stare was not vacant. It was an invitation, a key to a story the living had long since forgotten, a story it was now ready to tell. How can one open book be louder than 1,000 closed ones? Leaving the solitary relic of the nursery behind, Dr. Reed was drawn to the heart of the estate's intellectual life, Alistair Marlowe's library. The air inside was hermetically sealed by 50 years of silence, thick with the fine dust of forgotten knowledge. Thousands of spines stood in rigid formation, untouched and unread, a silent army awaiting a general who would never return. Yet, amidst this perfect, uniform stillness, there was a profound anomaly. A single volume, bound in dark crimson leather, lay open upon a solitary reading lectern, a single island of intent in an ocean of neglect. Her gloved finger traced the air above the page, the scent of decaying paper and dry leather a funereal perfume. It was a collection of Jacobean tragedies, and the book was opened to a specific passage. The words, stark in the beam of her flashlight, spoke not of sorrow, but of a more corrosive force: betrayal. It was a soliloquy on the damnation reserved for one who breaks a sacred vow, a soul consigned to an eternity of reliving its own treachery. This was not random. This was a message, a psychological breadcrumb left by a man descending into his own private hell. Was this a confession, staged for an audience that would never arrive? A house remembers. The discovery shifted the focus of Dr. Reed's investigation from the general despair of the Marlowe family to the specific calculus of Alistair's guilt. The ghostly whispers and the sorrowful portrait of Ilara were echoes of a tragedy, but this book felt like a cause. Even now, we leave behind our own digital books and search histories, our own coded confessions for others to find. This open page was Alistair's final status update, a declaration of his tormented state of mind moments before the silence fell. The passage was not the story's end. It was a map pointing toward the nature of Alistair's sin. How can a single space be both room temperature and colder than a winter grave? Leaving the silent judgment of the library's open book, Dr. Reed moved down the hall. She was drawn to the one room that was the heart of any home, and the source of this one's deepest sorrow, the master suite. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dried lavender and decay. Yet it was not cold, not at first. It was simply a room asleep, its grand four-poster bed a dark island in a sea of dust motes dancing in her flashlight beam. Everything felt hauntingly ordinary until she raised the camera. Dr. Reed lifted the thermal imaging device, its small screen glowing with the mundane oranges and yellows of residual warmth. She swept it across the ornate fireplace, the wardrobe, the vanity table. Then she panned toward the bed. A violent splash of deep cobalt and purple bloomed on the screen, a stark, impossible stain of cold clinging to the right side of the mattress. It was a plunge of nearly 20 degrees Celsius in mere seconds, a thermal wound in the fabric of the room. The cold was so intense, so localized, it was as if a block of dry ice had been placed there moments before. Yet the antique silk coverlet was untouched. She lowered the camera, her own breath misting in the air before her. There was no draft. The immense windows were sealed, caulked with 50 years of brine. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was a pocket of negative space, an absence of heat so profound it felt like a presence. What science could possibly explain a cold that defied thermodynamics, a cold that had boundaries as sharp as a knife's edge? Echoes of the forgotten. This data was precisely the kind of evidence that elevated paranormal history from speculation to a measurable science. It demonstrated that some unseen force could physically alter its environment, leaving a tangible footprint for those with the right tools to find. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a residual memory, it was an active, physical manifestation. The unnatural chill lingered, clinging not to the whole room, but to one specific, intimate space. A space where one person would have slept beside another. The question was no longer if something was in the mansion, but what was still lying in Alara Marlowe's empty place. How can a pocket of icy air suddenly bloom with the warmth of spring? The bone-deep chill that had saturated the master suite, a cold spot defying all thermodynamic logic, did not simply fade. It was violently displaced. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood frozen, not by the cold, but by the scent that now rushed in to fill the void. It was the rich, unmistakable fragrance of fresh-cut lilacs, so potent it was almost liquid in its intensity. A wave of sweet perfume in the heart of a decaying room that had not seen a living flower in 50 years. A haunting memory. Her research notes flashed in her mind. Alara Marlowe's journals, filled with pressed blossoms and poetic descriptions, spoke of her profound love for lilacs. She kept vases of them in this very room, a constant floral companion. If a sound can echo through time, why not a scent? The most powerful trigger of memory known to us. This was not a faint, lingering perfume clinging to old fabric. It was a full-bodied, living aroma, a sensory replay so astonishingly vivid it felt like an intrusion from another time, an olfactory ghost stepping out from the pages of Alara's diary. The house was not just replaying sounds, it was broadcasting its most intimate memories. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the fragrance vanished. One moment, the air was thick with the scent of a May garden. The next, it was nothing but the cold, stale smell of dust and decay. The sudden sterile absence was more jarring than the presence itself. Today, we understand how deeply scent is tied to our limbic system, the seat of memory and emotion. This phenomenon, while explainable in clinical terms as phantasmia, felt here like a deliberate, fleeting communication from the mansion's forgotten heart. The lilac was a memory, a fleeting echo, but its sudden presence seemed to unlock something else in the room, drawing attention to a detail previously overlooked. What does a house say when it believes no one is truly listening? Dr. Evelyn Reed sat alone in the grand foyer, her makeshift command center a stark island of modern technology in a sea of Gilded Age shadow. The cold blue light from her laptop screen painted her face in concentration. She donned her noise-canceling headphones, and the mansion's immense watchful silence was replaced by the clean, sterile hiss of digital playback. Her first review was of the nursery file. There it was, the child's laughter, no longer a fleeting sound, but a tangible artifact, a sharp, bright spike on the audio timeline. A ghost in the machine. She tagged it and moved on, her focus shifting to the recording from the master suite, the room of profound cold and the ghostly scent of lilacs. This file was different. The waveform was dense, heavy, showing a persistent low-frequency hum that corresponded exactly with her notes on the temperature drop. Echoes remain. She stared at the digital representation of that oppressive chill. How many sorrows could one room truly contain, and what shape did they take in pure sound? With practiced precision, she began to surgically filter the audio, isolating the anomaly from the background noise of the old house settling. She pushed the gain, listening intently, and then she heard it. Beneath the deep thrum of the cold, a fragile, almost subliminal pattern emerged. It was not the child's playful giggle, nor the sharp, sibilant whisper that had accosted her near Alara's portrait. It was the sound of weeping, a woman's quiet, inconsolable sobs, a lament trapped on a digital current. This is the core of modern paranormal research, where today's technology becomes a conduit, allowing us to bear witness to historical traumas that have been silent for generations. The evidence now confirmed two distinct presences, two separate tragedies bound to the Marlowe name. The first night was over, and a far more complex question now loomed before Dr. Reed. If the child was one forgotten soul, who then was the weeping woman? What if a house's memory was written in ink? The second day brought a profound shift. Dr. Evelyn Reed, moving from the grand rooms to the forgotten arteries of the mansion, found herself in a cramped servants' corridor. Her foot snagged a loose floorboard, its hollow knock a sharp break in the deep silence. Kneeling, she pried it up. There, nestled in the dark between joists, her gloved fingers found the cold, tooled leather of a small book. The inscription, faint but legible in faded gold leaf, read simply, "Annabel Croft." This was not a phantom scent of lilacs or a disembodied whisper. It was an artifact. It was testimony from a ghost of a different sort, a person erased by the tragedy of her employers. As governess to the Marlowe children, Annabel Croft was an intimate observer, not quite family, but more than staff.
She was privy to the private tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Gilded Age propriety. Could this diary, this entombed voice, finally give context to the solitary rocking horse, the unnatural cold, and the deep sadness in Ilara Marlowe's painted eyes? A voice unheard. How many other stories like this are buried, waiting for a chance discovery to rewrite our understanding of the past? The search for hidden narratives is why history remains a living thing. It reminds us today that official accounts are rarely the whole truth, and that the most profound insights often come from the margins, from the voices of those who were meant to be seen and not heard. This diary was more than a clue. It was the resurrection of a forgotten life. The question was no longer what the house remembered, but what its most intimate witness dared to record. And now, with the cover open, the first brittle page held a 50-year-old secret, waiting at last to be read aloud. Can a room remember an argument long after its voices have gone silent? In the dining room, Dr. Evelyn Reed was lost in the governess's diary. Her high-frequency recorder sat nearby, a silent, patient witness to the oppressive quiet. The only sound was the turn of a page. Later, during her evidence review, the silence played back with a terrifying clarity. Through the soft hiss of empty air, a voice erupted. It was a man's, sharp with a cold fury she recognized from her research, Alistair Marlowe. Then another, a woman's, desperate and pleading, Ilara. It was not a distant whisper, but a full-throated argument, a phantom performance of rage and fear captured from the very air where she had been sitting. The words were fractured, yet their meaning was horribly clear. "You will not defy me in this," Alistair's voice boomed, a spectral echo of his iron will. Ilara's reply was a sob-choked plea about a promise he had broken. How many other moments of passion and pain are imprinted on this place, waiting for the right conditions to replay? The house remembers. This was not a ghost trying to communicate. It was a scar, an emotional wound left on the fabric of the mansion. This recording was a profound breakthrough. It transformed subjective chills and sense into something quantifiable. The phenomenon, known today as electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP, provides paranormal historians their most compelling and controversial data, the potential for history to finally speak for itself. The past was in the air. Dr. Reed listened again, the conflict sharp in her headphones. But it was Alistair's final, venomous phrase, a threat directed not at Ilara, but at someone else entirely, that sent a fresh chill down her spine and gave her a terrifying new direction. After the echoes of fury, what remains?
The harsh, clipped argument from the dining room was a ghost of Alistair Marlowe's iron will. But as Dr. Reed analyzed the spectral quarrel, a new sound permeated the silence. It was not a shout, it was not a whisper. It was a pure, heartbreaking melody. In the grand foyer, the argument's waveform glowed on her screen. Then she heard it, a faint, disembodied humming from the second floor. It was a lullaby, impossibly gentle, steeped in a grief so profound it made the air heavy. It drew her up the grand staircase, back toward the room holding the solitary relic of a child. The house remembers. The sound grew stronger by the nursery door. It emanated directly from the far corner, from the empty space where the ornate crib sat, a cradle of shadows. Unlike the violent energy of the argument or the suddenness of the first whispered word, this was sustained, a continuous loop of sorrowful music. It was a lament woven into the very fabric of the room. Can a building hold on to sorrow just as it holds on to anger, preserving it like a fossil in stone?
This was not the sound of a fleeting moment, but of a long, quiet ache. This was the other side of the coin to Alistair's rage, a sound linked to the phantom lilacs and the governess's diary. It was the sound of loss. Dr. Reed stood frozen, her equipment forgotten. She was no longer just an investigator. She was an audience to a century-old tragedy, a performance of despair that never ended. Our own homes bear witness to our deepest joys and sorrows, becoming archives of the lives within them. The technology changes, but the emotional residue we leave behind may be a constant. This sorrowful lullaby was proof. She did not yet know this mournful tune was the key, a sonic fingerprint from a forgotten soul. What is the shape of a house's memory when it finally shows its face? The lullaby had faded, leaving the profound silence of the second floor. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, the nursery melody a ghost in her headphones. The hallway stretched, a tunnel of absolute blackness carved from moonlight. It was a void that seemed to swallow both light and sound. Then, at the far end of that void, the darkness coalesced. It gathered into a form darker than the shadows that birthed it. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing with impossible rigidity. There was no face, no detail, only a stark silhouette against the gloom. Yet Evelyn Reed knew the posture instantly. The proud, unyielding stance from photographs, the form of Alistair Marlowe, an echo of sorrow. For a clinical mind like Reed's, sight is the final arbiter of truth. Yet her cameras saw nothing. Her thermal imager registered only the uniform cold of the old house. Her own eyes told a different story. A trick of the light? Exhaustion playing on a mind steeped in the mansion's tragedy? The figure remained, a silent tear in the fabric of her reality. It did not move. It did not breathe. It simply was. Here, the line between documentation and experience blurs into something unsettling. Modern science speaks of pareidolia, the brain's need to find patterns in random stimuli. But what Reed witnessed felt less like perception, more like a presentation, a deliberate act of remembrance. It held for 23 seconds before dissolving, its form unraveling back into the darkness. The shadow was gone, but it had left something tangible in its wake. It was not just an apparition, it was a signpost. The figure had stood before one door she had not yet opened, Alistair Marlowe's private study. The house was no longer whispering its secrets, it was now showing her where the darkest one was kept. What secrets are buried not in soil, but in brick and mortar? The governess's diary, a brittle testament to a household's collapse, had pointed the way.
Her frantic, spidery script spoke of Alastair's growing paranoia, his descent from industrial titan to a man haunted by his own home, culminating in one chilling entry. "He speaks of a terrible secret in the wine cellar," she wrote, "a profound mistake that must be walled away from God's sight forever." Following this century-old map of madness, Dr. Evelyn Reed descended the worn stone steps into the mansion's belly. The air, cool above, grew thick and strangely still, clinging to her skin with a damp chill. It carried the cloying scent of damp earth, soured wine, and something else, the faint mineral tang of decay. It was a place of preservation, of things left to age and spoil in absolute darkness. The endless rows of empty racks stood like the skeletal remains of forgotten feasts, silent witnesses to a long-vanished opulence. A house remembers. Her flashlight beam, a surgeon's blade cutting through the gloom, played across the far wall, a vast expanse of ruddy brick. Most of it was original, laid with the meticulous precision of Gilded Age craftsmen, its mortar dark with age. But then she saw it. A rectangular section, roughly the size of a doorway, where the mortar was a shade too pale, crumbling slightly at the edges. The bricks themselves were mismatched, their faces sharper, less worn by the slow, damp breath of 100 years. Dr. Reed ran a gloved hand over the surface. It was rough, uneven, hurried. This was not the work of a master mason. This was the work of fear. How much desperation does it take to turn a part of one's own home into a tomb? This wasn't construction. It was a frantic, brutal act of concealment, an effort to build a permanent, final silence around a single terrible truth. Even today, we understand that the most damning evidence is often what has been deliberately hidden. The act of concealment is itself a confession. The governess had seen the first crack in Alastair's psyche. Reed was now staring at its physical, undeniable manifestation in brick and stone. The wall was a seal, a hastily made barrier between Alastair Marlowe's gilded world and a secret he was willing to bury. And now, the only question that mattered was what or who lay waiting on the other side. What if a prison's most desperate plea was etched in pure silence? Following the governess's frantic entry, Dr. Reed returned to the wine cellar's suffocating cold. The air tasted of damp earth and decay. Her hand found the patch of brickwork that felt wrong, its mortar starkly newer than the surrounding stone. She pressed the contact microphone's small metallic disc to the surface, turning the very house into a diaphragm, listening for a heartbeat within the stone. The initial feedback was nothing, only the low hum of the earth. Then, a subtle scraping, like fabric dragged against rough brick. Dr. Reed held her breath, adjusting the recorder's gain. And through the static, a voice emerged, impossibly close. It was not the sorrowful, melodic tone of Ilara's lullaby.
This was a whisper, dry and brittle with desperation, a sound stripped of everything but a single, raw need. 3 words spoken directly to her, as if she had pressed an ear to a tomb. "Let me out." This was no echo, it was a message. The other recordings were photographs of sound, moments frozen in time. This was a voice reaching across the void, an intelligence aware and trapped. How many other souls remain sealed within our histories, their stories entombed until the right instrument is applied? An echo forgotten. This reality mirrors modern forensics, where our tools give voice to victims the past tried to silence forever. Alastair Marlowe's cruelty solidified into something monstrous. This wall was not an anomaly, it was a cage. The mansion had given up Ilara's ghost, a tragedy of sorrow, but now it revealed a secret far darker than a lonely song. The question was no longer what happened here, but who.
was still here. A name, whispered from a wall, demanded its story finally be told. The spectral plea from the wine cellar was not for Ilara or Alistair, but for someone new, someone completely forgotten. Back in the grand foyer, surrounded by the silent ghosts of Marlowe ambition, Dr. Evelyn Reed traded her audio equipment for the cold glow of a laptop. She dove into the digitized town archives, her search parameters locked tightly on the year 1923. The screen illuminated her face as she scrolled through brittle, scanned documents, property deeds, business licenses, the mundane daily pulse of a town a century dead. Then she found it. It was not a headline, but a footnote buried deep in a weekly police blotter dated a mere 2 days before the Marlowe tragedy. A brief report detailed a young housemaid, Clara, who worked directly for the Marlowes, being reported as a runaway by Alistair himself. The case was marked as open, then immediately forgotten, swallowed by the sensational horror that followed. A forgotten voice. Her existence had been reduced to a single, dismissive paragraph. Clara was an inconvenience, a loose thread in the days leading up to the family's violent end. The official narrative simply erased her completely. Why was a missing person employed in a house of such staggering prominence never truly investigated? Why was a machinery of local justice, it seemed, had little time for a servant girl when a tycoon's family lay dead? This oversight, this deliberate turning away, speaks to a silence that persists even today, where the stories of the marginalized are so often the first casualties of a larger, more powerful tragedy. Clara's name was not just missing from the investigation, it was absent from the legend itself. Dr. Reed knew the house hadn't forgotten her. Now the central question changed. Was Clara a witness who fled, or was she the first victim? What truth can a pinhole of light reveal in absolute darkness? The plea for Lillian, a name from the wall, led Dr. Reed to this final measure. The diamond-tipped drill bit whined against old mortar, a modern sound in the ancient cellar's silence. Dust, smelling of lime and a century of stillness, puffed from the hole as the endoscope's thin body broke through into the void. On the monitor, a darkness so complete it felt solid, stared back an abyss contained within the mansion's bones. Reed activated the fiber optic light. A tiny sun bloomed on the screen, illuminating a space no larger than a coffin stood on end. The air inside must have been dead for generations. As she navigated the lens, the camera panned across the rough, rust-colored surface of the bricks, the interior side of the wall. And then she saw them. Faint at first, then stark and undeniable in the artificial glare. A forgotten echo. They were not tool marks or random scars of time. They were frantic, overlapping gouges, dug deep into the soft clay of the bricks and the mortar. Thin, parallel lines ending in splintered, desperate arcs. It was the undeniable signature of human fingernails scraping for a life just inches away on the other side of the wall. The governess's words about Alistair's terrible secret were no longer just ink on a page. They were a verdict etched by the victim. How many other stories remain sealed behind walls, real or metaphorical? This discovery transcends the paranormal. It is an act of historical justice, unearthing a truth deliberately buried. It reminds us that our present is often built over silenced tragedies we have a duty to uncover. For Dr. Evelyn Reed, all professional detachment shattered. This was no longer a haunting, it was a murder scene. The evidence confirmed the victim, Lillian, and the horrifying nature of her tomb. But the scratches, in their silent screaming, posed a far more terrifying question. They pointed to the crime, but not to the hand that sealed the final brick. Can a room hold the memory of a single terrible meal? The air in the Marlowe dining hall grew thick, the pressure dropping so low it felt hard to breathe. The faint scratches from the cellar seemed a distant memory as a new, more potent echo asserted itself. Dr. Reed stood frozen, an unwilling guest at a banquet of ghosts. As twilight bled through the tall dining room windows, the clink of silver against porcelain was the only sound. Alistair sat rigid at the head of the table, his knuckles white around a wine glass, his silent fury a palpable force that chilled the room. The scene was not a memory, but a living wound replaying itself. Ilara Marlowe refused to meet his eyes, her beautiful face a mask of contained grief. A single tear traced a path through her powder, a silent, liquid rebellion against the suffocating control that governed their lives. The two children, so small and still, pushed food around their plates, their fear a tangible thing in the space between them. They had learned that absolute silence was their only defense against their father's volatile nature.
Was this the moment the house fractured forever? The instant its foundation became sorrow instead of stone? This was the source of the arguments, the genesis of the nursery's endless lullaby. A forgotten echo. This vision was the nexus, the focal point of all the mansion's pain. It explained the plea for Lillian, a servant who must have witnessed this slow-motion collapse. We see this today, how places of great emotional upheaval seem to retain a charge, a psychic stain that time cannot fully scrub away. The energy of profound human trauma is not so easily dispersed. Then the silence broke. Alistair rose slowly, a predator unfolding. He raised his crystal glass, the deep red wine catching the last of the dying light like captured blood. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, chilling pronouncement that cut through the tension like a shard of ice. He raised his glass, not in celebration, but as a final, terrible seal upon their fate. What happens when a house's memory finally develops a fist? The vision of that final, terrible dinner had shattered the mansion's melancholic quiet. The echoes were no longer passive replays of sorrow like Ilara's lullaby or the phantom scent of lilacs. The sorrow was curdling into something sharp, something venomous. The psychic residue was beginning to coalesce, to think, to act with a terrifying and immediate purpose. A house remembers. The change was announced not with a whisper, but with a roar. Dr. Evelyn Reed was in the library, the governess's diary open before her, when a sudden, violent gust of air tore through the stagnant room. A heavy, leather-bound volume on Alistair Marlowe's industrial acquisitions launched from a high shelf, tumbling end over end before crashing onto the floor just inches from her feet. The sound was a physical blow in the oppressive silence. This was not a memory. It was an attack. The previous phenomena had been like psychic photographs, faded images of moments long past. This was a physical manifestation, an object moved with impossible force and undeniable intent. It was a direct response to her presence, to her prying investigation. How can a simple echo of the past suddenly learn to throw a punch in the present? The distinction is critical, marking the boundary between a place that is haunted and a place that is actively hostile. The violence did not stop there. Later, the door to the master suite, a room she had confirmed was locked, began to rattle in its frame with a furious, splintering energy. As she approached with her lantern, another cold, localized wind, far stronger than the one that accompanied the phantom lilacs, snuffed out the flame, plunging her into absolute, suffocating darkness. The message was unmistakable. Go. The echo answered.
This shift from residual to intelligent haunting is a terrifying and well-documented escalation in paranormal investigation, forcing a reevaluation of all prior evidence. The fragments of Alastair's personality, once scattered through the manor like dust motes in the light, were now gathering into a singular, malevolent consciousness. The passive haunting was over. The house, and whatever remained of its master, was now fighting back, and its next move was chillingly unknown. How does a house choose between its two spectral masters? The violent energy of Alastair Marlowe, unleashed by the vision of the final dinner, now pulsed through the mansion's very bones. Yet something pushed back, a gentle and desperate countercurrent. Standing before the heavy oak door of Alastair's study, Dr. Reed felt it most acutely. The phantom scent of lilacs, once a fleeting, delicate note, was now a crushing, funereal wave of perfume so thick it was difficult to breathe. It was a fragrant wall, an aromatic barrier built against the rising tide of malice. This was not a haunting, it was a defense. The weeping whisper, that first fragile sound captured in the foyer, returned. This time, it was not a random echo of sorrow. It was focused. It clung to the air right at the threshold of the study. Her digital recorder, placed carefully on the floor, captured the faint static, giving way to a chilling sound. Beware. The word was unmistakable, a single sibilant plea formed from grief and air. A house remembers. Was this Ilara using the last of her spectral energy not to frighten, but to protect the first person to listen in nearly a century? The house was no longer just replaying its history, it was actively trying to change the course of this new chapter. This moment underscores a timeless human lesson, the importance of heeding the subtle warnings that often precede disaster. We are often deaf to the quiet alarms, the gentle nudges from our own intuition, until it is too late. For Dr. Reed, the academic veil was torn away. This was now a direct, personal caution. The warning was clear, a spectral line drawn in the dust of the forgotten hallway. But the dark, cold heart of the Marlowe tragedy beat behind that very door, and Alastair's violent memory was a gravity she could not escape. Just what terrible secret was Ilara so desperate to keep locked away inside? How much hope can be folded into a single piece of paper? Guided by the lingering protective energy Ilara projected, Dr. Reed returned to the master suite. In the oppressive quiet of the room, her hand was drawn to an ornate rosewood jewelry box on the vanity. A false bottom, a secret known only to its owner, gave way with a soft click, to reveal a folded sheet of brittle yellowed paper. It was a letter, addressed to a sister, in a clear, elegant hand that trembled only slightly. Unfolding it was like releasing a breath held for nearly a century. The ink, faded but resolute, detailed not sorrow, but a meticulous, desperate plan. Ilara was going to flee. She had arranged for a carriage to wait at the edge of the woods, packed small bags for the children, and secured what little funds she could call her own. Her departure was set for the morning of October 23, 1892. The day after the final terrible dinner. This was not a portrait of a broken woman succumbing to fate. It was the last testament of a survivor who was just one day short of her freedom, an echo of the forgotten. This fragile document changes everything. It's a key that unlocks the true nature of the haunting. The sorrow was not just for a life lost, but for a life that was almost reclaimed. How many cries for help are written but never sent, becoming ghosts in their own right? The unsent letter serves as a chilling reminder that even today, the most desperate battles for freedom are often fought in silence, their plans hidden away in secret hopes. Dr. Reed now held the proof of Alara's courage, a defiance written in ink. The date was the most damning evidence of all. She had planned her escape for the very next morning. This knowledge transforms the mansion's sorrow into something sharper, more sinister. The tragedy was no accident of despair. It was not a sudden, unpredictable act of passion. It was a response. The letter wasn't just Alara's plan for a new life. It was the motive for her murder. And it raises the terrifying question that now hangs over the entire estate. Alastair knew. What is more damning than a lie? A truth told too late. The final pages of the governess's diary were not written. They were clawed onto the paper. Dr. Evelyn Reed saw the smudged ink, a testament to trembling hands. A new name surfaces from the household staff, Clara, a young housemaid. She stole a few coins to send to her ailing family. The governess describes hiding behind the heavy library door. She saw Alastair hold the coins in the lamplight. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, vibrating growl that shook the floorboards. Her silence was a cage built of fear. It was not the theft that paralyzed her. It was the chilling void she saw in Alastair's eyes. This was the same monstrousness Alara tried to flee in her unsent letter. This confession was not just about Clara. It was about the terror Alastair Marlowe cultivated, a poison that seeped into the very mortar of the mansion. So, when Clara vanished the next morning, the governess said nothing, a terrible silence. How many injustices are buried by the fear of confronting a greater evil? This pattern of silent complicity is not a relic of a forgotten era. It is a ghost that haunts our own modern hallways, a quiet agreement to ignore the powerful when they commit wrongs. This terrible admission reframes everything: the phantom sense, the cold spots, even Alara's desperate warning. They were not just memories of sorrow. They were echoes of a hidden, brutal crime that the house was forced to witness. The governess's confession, however, contained one final damning detail. A location was scribbled in the margin. It was a place Alastair went alone on the night Clara disappeared, a place she was forbidden to ever approach. And now Dr. Reed knew exactly where she must go next. Where does a story of poison and betrayal finally end? All paths, every whisper, now converged on one point: Alastair Marlowe's study. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood before the heavy oak door, a barrier she had instinctively avoided. The governess's confession made it unavoidable. A palpable dread, cold and acidic, seeped through the wood. It felt like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, knowing the ice was thin. The house remembers. The diary confirmed it all: the final dinner, the poison, the complicity. This study was Alastair's sanctum, the crucible of his domestic tyranny. From here, he orchestrated the lives and deaths of his family.
The malevolent energy gripping the mansion was anchored to this space, a spiritual generator humming with a century of unresolved rage. Every other event was an echo of decisions made within these walls. Dr. Reed knew whatever she was fighting, its heart was there. She reached for the ornate brass knob. It refused to turn. She pushed. The door was solid, unmoving. Her fingers traced the seam and felt it, the cold finality of a deadbolt thrown from the other side. But how can a room be bolted from within by a hand long turned to dust? This was not a residual haunting, a simple playback of past trauma. This was an active, intelligent, and defensive presence. We know intense events can leave an imprint on a location, a psychic scar tissue. But the mansion demonstrated something more, a will that could physically manipulate its own prison. The lock was not a memory, it was a statement, a warning. Alastair was still in his study, still in command, and he had no intention of allowing his darkest secret to be disturbed. The cold seeping from under the door was a possessive, territorial breath. The plea for Lillian, the terrible vision, Ilara's desperate plea, it all led to this impossible bolted door. Now, the question was no longer what happened in this house. It was what is still happening behind that impenetrable slab of oak. What sound does desperation make against a century of silence? The governess's terrible confession, Ilara's unsent letter of escape, the oppressive aura. Every clue had converged, leading Dr. Evelyn Reed to this final, sealed threshold. The study door. Diplomacy had failed. Science had reached its limit. Her last night in the house demanded a final, forceful act, a path to truth. The cold steel of the crowbar bit into the ancient oak frame, a modern tool against a forgotten lock. Wood groaned, then splintered with a deafening crack that shot through the mansion's quiet heart, a gunshot shattering a tomb's solemnity. It was an act of violation, a trespass against the dead's final wish for privacy. Yet, as the door shuddered open, it felt less like a breaking and more like a necessary release. Was this an act of desecration, or one of liberation for the souls trapped within this suffocating narrative? The history of Marlowe Mansion was not just a story to be observed. It was a wound that had never been allowed to heal, festering behind this single, stubborn barrier. A wave of pressure and profound, unnatural cold rushed from the opening, a physical force that staggered her. It was not the passive chill of the master suite, but an active, malevolent presence with weight and intent. This was Alastair's core, the nexus of his control, breached at last. The air grew thick with the phantom scent of old paper, dry leather, and something else, a faint, acrid smell like burnt almonds, the ghost of poison. The whispers that had haunted the halls now coalesced into a single, overwhelming roar of psychic energy. Our own history is filled with such locked rooms, inconvenient truths sealed away by generations of silence. Uncovering them requires not just patience, but the courage to force a confrontation with a past that refuses to stay buried. For what poured from the darkness was not just an echo of rage, but an answer finally given voice. How can a room so orderly contain such complete chaos? After forcing the door, the silence in Alastair's study was absolute. Dr. Evelyn Reed stepped into air unmoved for 50 years, a pristine tomb of leather and mahogany. She stood in the study in the late afternoon, watching dust motes dance in a single sunbeam. Nothing was out of place. It was a space frozen by a will stronger than time itself. This perfect order amplified the room's single focus, the desk. Upon it sat a large black leather-bound book. Not a diary, but a ledger, its sheer weight a statement of authority. Reed knew instantly this object was the source of the oppressive aura, the calculating heart of the mansion's pain. Every vision and all the sorrow radiated from this single, silent point. The governess's confession and Ilara's unsent plea were symptoms of the sickness recorded in these pages. They were orbits around a gravitational center of pure malevolence. How does one document the unraveling of a family with the cold dispassion of a financial account? This book was the answer, a testament to Alastair's ownership of every soul under his roof. Echoes of the forgotten. Dr. Reed felt a chill that was purely human. This ledger contained more than numbers. It was a meticulous record of control, a logbook of cruelty disguised as household management. The purchase of lilac seeds for Ilara's garden recorded with the same precision as the procurement of an untraceable poison. Even now, Hidden records possess the power to rewrite history, exposing foundational lies buried by time. Truth often lies dormant, not in grand speeches, but in the quiet entries of an account book. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, the leather cool and unnervingly smooth. The weight of every ghost in Marlowe Mansion pressed down on her as she prepared to open the cover. What terrible accounting would the very first page reveal? What is the final entry in the ledger of a ruined Ran? In Alastair's study, Dr. Evelyn Reed found the answer. The vast book lay open, its first pages a monument to order, detailing steel shipments with confident penmanship. But as she turned them, the numbers told a story of catastrophic losses and desperate loans. The Marlowe Empire was not just failing, it was a hollowed-out shell. This mansion was built on a foundation of sand. Here was the context for the governess's fear, the source of the rage that echoed in the dining hall. It was not arrogance, it was the terror of a titan watching his kingdom crumble. Every shouted word Reed had recorded was a symptom of this deep, corrosive failure. How does a man who measures his worth in assets react when his balance sheet shows only zero? The numbers were the first confession, a silent admission of defeat, a ledger of sins. Then the script shattered. The final few pages were a frantic scrawl that tore at the paper. It was here Alastair confessed discovering Ilara's unsent letter, her plan for a new life, taking his children with her. He saw it not as escape, but as theft. His pride, already broken by financial ruin, was annihilated by this personal betrayal. He had lost his fortune, he would not lose his family. He would not be left with nothing. The last entry was cold. It was a plan. He wrote of the special vintage from the cellar and the odorless poison he added to it. He detailed his intention to end it all at that final dinner, a last supper where he would be both host and executioner. This was a final, terrible act of ownership. The ledger reminds us that the ghosts of economic despair and wounded pride can be the most violent of all. Dr. Reed closed the heavy cover, but the confession now had a voice, and it was beginning to speak to the house itself. The final entry was not written in ink, but in pure cruelty. Alastair Marlowe's meticulous script, which had tracked steel and stock prices with cold precision, now detailed the disposal of a human life. The subject, listed with the same detachment as a shipment of ore, was a housemaid named Clara. The ledger confirmed she had not run away, as the official story claimed. She had been a ghost long before the rest of the family. In the late evening, while polishing silver just outside the study, she heard the low murmur of Alastair's voice detailing his plot, the purchase, the dosage, the timing. A single silver spoon slipped from her grasp, its clatter on the chilly marble floor sealing her tragic fate. This was not a crime of passion. It was an act of brutal, calculated necessity to preserve a much darker secret. The ledger's words gave terrifying context to the evidence Dr. Reed had already uncovered. The false wall in the wine cellar, the faint, desperate scratches on the other side. Alastair had not simply killed her, he had lured her into the small alcove on the pretense of retrieving a rare vintage, then bricked her inside with materials he had stockpiled for weeks. He left her there to die, in the suffocating cold, in the absolute dark. He left her to perish over several agonizing days. How long does hope last when entombed in cold stone and absolute darkness? Her death was a dress rehearsal in cruelty, a prelude to the massacre he would unleash upon his own family just a week later. A forgotten voice. This final, horrifying truth reframes the entire tragedy of Marlowe Mansion.
It was not born from a single night of violence, but from a slow, festering evil that began with the silencing of the powerless. The stories of people like Clara are so often the ones history erases, footnotes in the grand tragedies of the wealthy and influential. Their whispers are the hardest to hear. For Dr. Evelyn Reed, this was the missing cornerstone of the entire haunting, the original sin from which all other sorrows flowed. The ledger explained the housemaid's fate and the depth of Alastair's depravity, but with this last secret unearthed, the mansion's oppressive energy began to shift and coalesce once more. What happens when a buried truth is finally spoken aloud? In Alastair's study, the air grew frigid as Dr. Reed's voice gave life to the dead ink. Her words recounted the fate of Lillian, the forgotten maid. Dust motes hung suspended in the stillness. This was no longer an academic exercise. It was an incantation. The confession, held for a century, had become a powerful summons, and the house began to answer. From the shadows, three forms coalesced.
Ilara Marlowe appeared, her painted sorrow now fully three-dimensional. Beside her, her two small children shimmered, their eyes fixed not on Reed but on the ledger. They were not threats. They were silent witnesses, their long vigil finally validated. How can a presence so ethereal feel heavier than the weight of the house itself? They were the echoes of tragedy, finally heard. The echoes converge. But as their sorrow filled the study, a new vibration began from the floorboards beneath her feet. This was not Alastair's cold cruelty, nor Ilara's melancholy. It was something else. A furious, raw energy, a century of silent rage rising from the wine cellar. It reminds us that history's violent silences are not empty. They wait for a name to be called. Acknowledging the forgotten is a step toward justice, even a century too late. The sorrow of the Marlowe apparitions wavered, disrupted by this presence. The floorboards trembled, a low moan echoing from the foundation. Dr. Reed felt the shift. The mansion's haunting had now broken. The house had held many ghosts, but now it was about to face its oldest and most righteous one. How does a century of silence finally learn to scream? The cold in Alastair Marlowe's study was no longer a passive chill. It became a predator. It sank teeth of ice into the air, which crackled with a static charge, the scent of ozone sharp and clean. In the center of the study, between the desk and the cold hearth, motes of dust began to spin. Then, pages from the ledger lifted on their own, swirling into a tightening gyre of ink and rage. This was not a memory replaying itself. It was a memory fighting back, an archive of hate given a terrible kinetic life. The house remembers. The spinning vortex coalesced. It was not the shape of a man, but the idea of a man twisted by his own malevolence. A column of pure shadow, shot through with the furious script of the ledger, a storm of debits and cruelties. And from this formless throat came a sound that was not a sound. It was a psychic roar, a wave of pure, undiluted fury that slammed into Dr. Evelyn Reed's mind with a single, possessive, and soul-shattering command: mine. The word was a claim on the house, on the secrets, on the silence he had so carefully curated in life and in death. Then the room erupted. Books launched themselves from shelves like clay pigeons. A heavy crystal inkwell shot across the room and shattered against the far wall, spraying a black stain like arterial blood. The very timbers of the mansion groaned under the strain of this spectral tantrum, a violent outburst against the violation of his final, most damning secret. When a man's final testament is a confession of murder, what else can his ghost be but a monster? The rage was not just an emotion, it was the entity itself, a being defined by its refusal to be known. This is the ultimate danger of confronting the past. Buried truths do not decay. They fester, gaining a monstrous energy over time. The echoes of forgotten injustices can become a deafening roar when finally brought into the light. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood her ground, an academic facing a primary source that was actively trying to tear her very being apart. The storm of rage paused, its chaotic energy gathering, focusing, and turning its sightless gaze directly upon her. How do you fight a tyrant made of memory and rage? You do not fight his power at all. In the heart of Alistair Marlowe's study, surrounded by the predatory cold of his manifested will, Dr. Evelyn Reed understood. The swirling vortex of despair, the cowering echoes of Ilara and the governess, they were all symptoms. Alistair's power was not in his presence, but in their absence. He thrived on erasure. His ledger of sins was a monument to this power, reducing lives to mere entries, to problems solved and forgotten. To confront his shade directly would be to play his game, to acknowledge his dominance over the narrative he had so brutally authored. She had to rewrite the entire story, a name remembered. In that frigid, crackling air, Dr. Reed turned her gaze away from the coalescing shadow of Marlowe. She looked past the terrifying display into the very fabric of the room's memory. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout of defiance, but a clear, steady statement of fact, an academic correction delivered into the heart of a storm. Your name was Clara. You are not forgotten. The 3 sentences were a pebble tossed into a churning sea. What is a ghost, after all, but a story that has lost its name? The act was a pivot, a recentering of the entire tragedy away from the perpetrator and onto his first, unmourned victim. This was not spiritual warfare. It was an act of profound historical justice. It is a principle we still grapple with today. True remembrance is not just about recalling an event, but about restoring the identity of those who were silenced by it. By speaking Clara's name, Reed gave her agency beyond victimhood. She gave her a place in the history of the house that was not defined by her final violent moments, as recorded in Alistair's ledger. The haunting was never truly about him. It was about them. The oppressive weight in the study did not vanish. It fractured. The singular, malevolent focus of Alistair's shade wavered, as if confused by this sudden shift in the spiritual grammar of the room. A new echo, faint but distinct, began to resonate in the sudden quiet, a presence not of fear, but of acknowledgement. For the first time, one of the forgotten was being called home, and the house held its breath to see what would answer. What power does a forgotten name truly hold? The power to unmake a tyrant. When Dr. Reed spoke the name Clara, the predatory cold in Alistair's study did not fade. It shattered. The oppressive chill fractured like glass. A warmth bloomed, carrying the faint scent of lilacs. This was not an exorcism by force, but a dissolution by truth. The name was the memory Alistair spent in eternity trying to bury in rage. From that nascent light they appeared, not as tormented specters, but as luminous outlines, a family finally freed. Ilara, the children. Their sorrow, which had stained the very walls, was gone, replaced by a profound tranquility. They did not linger. They simply turned toward the warmth and dissolved into it, their century-long vigil complete. Was this forgiveness? Or was it simply the end of a story waiting to be told?
Their release was a quiet ascension. Alastair's end was the opposite. His shadow, the concentrated malevolence that held the house in its grip, convulsed. It was torn apart, not by an opposing force, but from within, by the memories it had tried to devour. There was no sound, yet the psychic scream of his dissolution was the loudest thing the mansion had ever known. Echoes fade. This reminds us that remembrance is not a passive act. It is a force that can rewrite the darkest narratives of history. The shadow was gone, its brutal rage silenced. But what becomes of a house when its most powerful memory is finally erased? How does a century of rage finally learn to be silent? It does not fade or retreat, it simply shatters. In Alastair Marlowe's study, the oppressive psychic weight that had defined the mansion for 99 years was gone. The predatory cold, broken by a forgotten name, left a vacuum. But nature abhors a vacuum, and into this one poured not more darkness, but a profound stillness, a quiet so complete it was a palpable physical substance. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood before the tall study window, unmoving. The first light of dawn, a hesitant gold, sliced through the grimy glass. It touched the dark wood of the desk where the ledger of sins lay open, not to illuminate the dancing dust of ages, but to seemingly erase it, leaving only clean, warm light in its wake. She felt its gentle touch on her face, a presence carrying no memory, no malice, no cold. It was simply morning, a house at rest. The silence was different now. It was not the tense, listening silence of a place holding its breath, waiting for the next spectral footstep or Ilara's disembodied plea. This was a quiet of resolution, a final calm that had been earned. But what is the sound of a haunting finally laid to rest? It is the gentle hum of the world outside, the distant song of a bird, the rustle of leaves, simple sounds suffocated by the mansion's sorrow for generations, now allowed back inside. Dr. Reed knew she was hearing the house truly exhale for the very first time. This act of naming, of speaking a buried truth aloud, is not just a tool for historians alone. It is the fundamental mechanism by which we heal our own haunted spaces, demanding that the ghosts of our collective past answer for their cruelty before they can be dismissed. The profound peace that settled over Marlowe Mansion is the peace that comes only after a long overdue, painful reckoning. The air no longer tasted of dust and regret. The phantom scent of lilacs, once Ilara's desperate warning, was gone, replaced by the simple, clean smell of old paper and wood in the sun. The echoes fade. The tyrant was gone. But as the light grew stronger, filling every corner of the room that had been the heart of darkness, another presence began to coalesce within the new tranquility. A whisper was forming on the quiet air, not of rage, but of gratitude. What remains when a house finally exhales its ghosts? Dr. Evelyn Reed pulled the great oak door shut, its sound a soft, final click. The sun warmed the stone where shadows had clung for a century. She was not leaving a haunted place, but a memorial where the victims had finally testified. Her files contained more than data. They held the weight of a story suffocated by mortar, a human truth far more chilling than any specter. The mansion was quiet now, its long duty as a prison and tomb finally over. Her mission had fundamentally changed. Her tools had only unlocked a door to a profound human tragedy. The true evidence was never the phantom lullaby or the cold, but the confession in a governess's diary and the finality of Alastair's ledger. How many other histories are buried not in graves, but within forgotten walls, waiting for a name to be spoken aloud? This was no longer about proving the existence of spirits. It was about the sacred act of historical justice, an echo heard. The book she would write would not be another ghost story. Its title would mention not the haunting, but the lives the mansion consumed. It would be a biography of the forgotten, a testament to Alara, Lillian, and the quiet courage of a maid named Clara. This work reminds us that the most terrifying phantoms are often the silenced truths of our own past, whose whispers still shape our present if we fail to listen. The world would soon learn of Alistair's evil, but the true measure of her success was yet to come, resting on one final crucial question.